Hello, everybody. My name is Lopez Matthews, and I am the chair of the Information Professionals of Asala organization. And I thank you for joining us today for our program, Adding to the Story, Langston Hughes and the Colorado Connection, featuring Deborah Hollis. And I would just like to say that our program today is part of a quarterly series that will be coming out of Information Professionals to share with those interested in Black history, those interested in Asala, interesting collections, be it archives, museums, or libraries, that people interested in African Americans can see, go view, and learn more about. And so we thank you all for joining us today. Our speaker is, and I've closed my window, Deborah Hollis, an associate professor on the University of Colorado Boulder Libraries faculty, and she leads special collections and teaching that inspires curiosity in students. She and her colleagues develop active learning assignments for class instruction, featuring rare works and primary sources that often results in students creating an artistic response. Her research and writings focus on the historic and continued lack of diversity in academic librarianship, designing special collections pedagogy and special subject collections analysis. And so as I invite Deborah to begin speaking, I ask that you all type your questions in the chat and we will have a question and answer session after her presentation. So Deborah, take it away.
Great, thank you, Lopez, and thanks to colleagues who are joining us today. I've got my talk written down because those of you who know me know that I meander. So I'll talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then I look forward to a discussion and reaction. So here we go. The current national discussion of dominant culture collections in U.S. academic archives and all matters related to diversifying archival holdings leaves out what remains hidden or actually buried in many university archives. Today, I want to highlight an example of a social network that was not easily discernible, at least to me. We who are information professionals know the importance of communicating with our patrons, the teaching faculty, and students on our campus to explain that much is buried and or ignored in these collections. African Americans, Asian Americans, multiracial Americans are everywhere. We know this, and I continue to discover evidence of buried or simply ignored individuals or communities in the CU Boulder archival holdings. With many well-intended colleagues scrambling to approach underrepresented people and organizations today, I say they ignore the need to assess what they currently have in hand. And Langston Hughes is a giant literary figure, of course, but he crossed paths with 4 different Coloradans who are not necessarily known outside of Boulder. This is something to consider when researching the Black literary arts and allies who were in the social networks of these artists, poets, and social activists. So today I highlight writers and a poet who knew Langston Hughes, but the collection's finding aids do not necessarily make this clear. This is an example. This example underscores that unless a student researcher is aware of the 20th century social protest movements or social justice organizations in the US at different periods, it may take more than footnotes to triangulate and uncover interactions or collaborations with minority communities. Okay, so how do I advance? Okay, this might be where I have to stop sharing for a second. And let's see. Sorry about this. Go to the next. I'm just going to do this in a very awkward fashion. Okay, so here, just a reminder, Langston Hughes, born in 1902 and passed away in 1967. And the Colorado connections are these 4 folks. CU professor Francis Woolley taught English at CU Boulder for 44 years and served in both world wars. His papers have been used in class writing assignments and student curated exhibitions, especially the correspondence he had with his students during both wars. It is the earliest communication in the Woolley papers that shows that Woolley corresponded with Langston Hughes in 1946, and I'm going to show you all that in a minute. Then we have Franklin Folsom and his wife, Mary Elting, who were CU alumni, and Franklin's father, Fred Folsom, was the university's football coach and on the law school faculty. And in fact, our football stadium is named in the coach's honor, Folsom Field. So Franklin and Mary were authors of children's nonfiction, and they were social activists and members of the League of American Writers. We do not actually have correspondence among the three, but Mary Elting mentions Langston in her papers. And then we have Florence Becker Lennon, who was a poet, Lewis Carroll biographer, and activist who had a radio program called The Enjoyment of Poetry on WEVD in New York City. She extended an invitation to Langston in 1957, and they corresponded from then on. Florence's papers contain some 15 letters or postcards, which I'll show you some of those shortly. And then here I explain that WEVD was the Socialist Party of America's radio station. And Florence featured emerging women and minority writers or poets of the day. Fortunately, she had the presence of mind to deposit the reel-to-reel recordings of her programs at the Library of Congress. And here we're going to have to just do this there. So can you all see? Okay, so here we go. Okay. So here I'm showing the earliest letter received and dated April 6th, and this is in the Woolley collection. So I'm just going to quickly read it to give you all an idea. Dear Professor Woolley, so they're not really familiar with each other at this point. At last, I am back in New York after weeks of reading my poems from California to Seattle to Mississippi to Boston. One of the most delightful stops in my long itinerary this season was my brief stay in Colorado, and I want to thank you for your part in helping make my visit to the state so pleasant. I shall not soon forget our drive from Boulder to Denver and the pleasant conversations with you, your wife, your wife and I had together. I hope I shall have the pleasure of seeing you both again in the not too distant future. The flight down to Albuquerque was a thrilling one over mountains and deserts on a wonderfully clear day. But while I was in Albuquerque, they had one of the heaviest snowstorms they have had in many years. Now that I am back in New York, I am hard at work on the lyrics of the musical version of Street Scene, Elmer Rice's old play. Kurt Weill has completed the music for the first act, and it is very beautiful indeed. I must have my part of the work done soon now, since he says it will take him all summer to do the orchestration, and the show is scheduled for rehearsal in September. With all good wishes to you both, I am sincerely yours, Langston Hughes. Thanks to Google, I was able to find a reference to Street Scene and this particular image that features Kurt Weill, Elmer Rice, and Langston Hughes. So, okay, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. Here we have, I just snipped a page of Yale's finding aid for Langston's papers. And note that the finding aid points out the League of American Writers, and that it covers correspondence or information related to LAW from 1932 to 43, roughly. And Florence Becker Lennon appears in the finding aid. However, her name is misspelled. So she isn't Florence Beaker Lennon, she was Florence Becker Lennon. And what I found interesting in searching through the Yale Finding Aid results is that there actually is no specific mention of Mary Elting, Franklin Folsom, or Frances Woolley. Okay, let's see. There, great. So here we see, so what is the League of American Writers? And this is where I am hypothesizing that it's through this association that the Folsoms may have met Langston. So the League was established in April of 1935, and it was at the first American Writers Conference, and it was a voluntary association of writers dedicated to the preservation and extension of a truly democratic culture. And Waldo Frank was elected to be the first national chairman. And Franklin Folsom in 1994, a year before he died, he authored a memoir about the group, since he, I believe, was the secretary of the group. And he also is referenced in a 1994 article, Langston Hughes is. The article by Franklin Folsom is The League of American Writers as I Found It, where Franklin observed the gentle wit and firm anger of Langston Hughes gave voice to mute rebels, both black and white, page 12. So let's see. Let's go to the next page. Thank you. So they could have met in the League of American Writers in professional meetings, but both Mary and Franklin, since they were authors of children's nonfiction, and they were very committed to publishing multicultural works that reflected a world that a lot of white children needed to be schooled in. Mary worked at a publishing house. Right now, I haven't been able to get back into our main library and our archives to confirm whether or not she was also on the staff at Franklin Watts. But it is through that connection that she recommends, according to her papers, that for the first book series, which she and her husband Franklin authored works like the first book of Nurses, the first book of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, they recommended that if you're going to have the first book of Negroes, you need to have a Black author author the work. So it may be that she and Franklin met Langston through that association. And apart from the Folsom papers, we have this small finding aid that explains that we have the originals of 3 printed and typed book publishing agreements and 4 letters of correspondence between Langston and Franklin Watts. So this is also a clue that their paths intersected. Next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, but it is through Langston's correspondence with Boulder poet Florence Becker Lennon that we learn of a critic whose path intersected with many 20th century Black poets. And as we see here, Langston suggests to Florence that she get in touch with Rosie Poole, who was a Dutch Jew who conducted literary analysis on the works of African Americans, or as we were known at the time, American Negro poets. So you'll see that there's this, really this equivalent of a tweet or a brief email dated June 28th, 1961. Dear Florence, I sort of envy you being in London. I rather like that old town. There are living in London 2 Dutch translators and authorities on Negro poetry, whom you might like to meet, who have BBC programs and are also in Holland. He refers to Miss Rosie Poole and someone who is actually a co-author, Mr. Paul Brayman. And he just casually ends the letter with Miss Poole lectured here in the States last year, and she was the teacher of Anne Frank in hiding. I remember reading that going, whoa, Okay, I'm not familiar with that story. So as a result of my family history, I was interested in who was Rosie Poole. And as you can see on the slide, she was born in 1905, lived through a very significant part of the 20th century and change. And she was 35 years old when Germany invaded the Netherlands. So she was an adult. She also co-authored with Bremen Ik zag hoe zwart ik was, versen van Noord-Amerikaanse negers, which translated is, I saw how black I was, verses from North American Negroes. She also won a Fulbright and was visiting faculty and did a tour in the South at various HBCUs. But she was also, for a time, I think she taught a course at Salisbury, North Carolina, which is Livingston College today. And then just earlier in the week, when I was Googling and preparing for this talk, I saw that AJM Herlings just produced a dissertation called Survivor Agitator, Rosie E. Poole and the Transatlantic Century. So this Dutch person did a dissertation, and it is like 400 pages and available online in a PDF, and it was just last year. So Rosie Poole edited this title, which is featured here, Beyond the Blues, New Poems by American Negroes, selected and introduced by Rosie E. Poole. And so many of you may be aware of this work, but again, it was a new discovery for me, and it was rather exciting. So that was published in 1962, and according to WorldCat, there are audio book versions available. Could you go to the next slide, please? So let's see. Okay. So again, another letter from Langston to Florence, dated November 2nd. So this is after something called the First National Poetry Festival, held in the Library of Congress, which took place October 22nd through the 24th in 1962. I did not realize that that was when they had the first National Poetry Festival. I thought that the poetry festivals didn't really get going until the 1970s, but so here's this clue in Florence's papers. So Florence had a separate gathering, or someone organized a separate gathering of these poets, and it was recorded. And the audio tape is available from the Library of Congress. So here you'll see that Langston says in his letter, "It's so nice to have your Life of Lewis Carroll to put beside your 40 years, which I've so enjoyed having, and it was good to see you at the Poetry Festival. I hope the tape turned out okay, best ever." So that confirms it was recorded. And actually, it was just because I was listening to old recordings of Florence's radio program, and this particular recording was tacked on at the end of one of her interviews. So I hadn't put two and two together to figure out that perhaps the recording was somewhere. So here we see that it's a half hour. It begins with Sam Allen, who reads American Gothic to Satch. Gwendolyn Brooks read Mrs. Small from the Bean Eaters. Mrs. Georgia Douglas Johnson was mentioned in the anthology, but she doesn't have a poem in the anthology, and she read The Audacious. Owen Dotson read two poems, Tell Rachel He Whispered and The Widow's Walk. And then Florence introduces their hostess, May Miller, who read The Last Warehouse. Julia Fields read something called I Heard a Young Man Saying. And then we see number 7, Langston Hughes read his own poem, but he also read a couple of poems by County Cullen. And he goes on to describe Cullen as a lyric poet primarily. Cullen could write sonnets, is what Hughes says, and Hughes describes himself as a folk or ethnic poet. Then Gwendolyn Brooks reads We Real Cool. And Florence then reads a poem by Claude McKay. and says that McKay has a special place in her heart because he gave her her start by publishing 2 of her poems in The Liberator. And then she makes a note of saying that she didn't always agree with McKay's stances. And one of the quotes I remember was, "I think that Jews know what Negroes feel," is what Florence says. Then Florence turns to Rosie Poole and she poses a question about segregated anthologies of poetry. And then that highlights to the listener that Poole had surveyed American anthologies 3 years ago, which were used in high school and colleges. And Rosie Poole found that few contained Negro poets. She found that if or when Negro poets were included, they were James Weldon Johnson, they were rarely Paul Laurence Dunbar, and then maybe some would contain works by Langston Hughes. She went on to explain why Negroes had difficulty in getting published and said to be a Negro in America is to have certain experiences that other Americans haven't got. What does a poet write about? What is in his heart and mind? And Poole goes on to explain or state publishers are businessmen and are reluctant to publish these types of works. So she was committed to showing America, the world, and Europe the wealth and beauty that had been created by Negroes in Negro poetry. And then you'll see on number 11, Hughes then praises Poole's work, says that she did a good job and it's very noble work and something that is at this historical point in our lives what is needed. Almost makes one think that some things don't change. It's very relevant to today. Then Langston goes on to read a section from Ask Your Mama called Cultural Exchange, and he explains that he was going to read it at the National Poetry Festival. And then Florence closes with an international poem by Thomas Hardy called In Time, in the Breaking of Nations. Next slide, please. Okay, so then I just wanted to highlight that Poole really was one of the driving forces, but there was much Dutch interest in, as they refer to it, as Negro poetry in the time. And here is a Dutch publication called De Neger Zingt, so The Negro Sings, Amerikaanse Neger Lyriek, so American Negro lyrics. And I just put the Dutch translation next to the English translation of I2. So it just doesn't sound the same, but I'm showing my cultural bias. But ook ik is I too, and ook ik zing Amerika, I too sing America. Ik ben de donkere broeder, men stuurt me naar de keuken, so people direct me to the kitchen. Als een gast verschijnt, maar ik lach. Ik eet, ik word zeer sterk, So it's a good reminder that a lot of Black poets' works were translated into other languages. And sometimes I think that American colleges and universities don't do a good job of pointing out what other countries had major interest. Next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, thank you. Here's an example of a postcard, which always makes young people giggle today. So, we explained, like, before Twitter, before social media, there were these things called postcards. And this is a small one. And it's also, you can see on the left side of the card that it's personalized. So it has his address. And in this case, this is from November 1st, 1961. And by this time, you can tell that Florence and Langston are their friends to the extent that there are no more formal salutations. And he explains, I'd love to do a program of African poetry on your show, since I am right now editing such an anthology for Indiana University Press for late spring. But then he talks about how, well, it would also be a good opportunity to read from Ask Your Mama. And what caught my eye was that since there wasn't enough room on the very bottom of the postcard in the typewriter, which those of us of a certain age can remember, he scrawls an explanation at the very bottom that explains that he's off to Washington to meet the poet Senghor of Senegal. I was not familiar with this Senegalese poet, but Leopold Sédar Senghor was very significant. And as you can see from the Wikipedia entry, he was a politician, cultural theorist who for 2 decades served as the first president of Senegal. So how exciting that obviously Senghor was in Washington and Langston caught up with him. And so next slide, please. Let's see. Okay. And then I just wanted to jump to, this is the last exchange between Florence and Langston. It is April 14th, again on his personalized postcard stationery. And he explains, the Poetry Society dinner I thought was most delightful, and it was a great pleasure seeing you again, although I regret we did not share the same table, as I thought we would when I got your kind invitation. I tried successfully twice today to reach you by phone, so finally left word that I cannot accept your invitation for the press club dinner, since I'm having a series that week of long postponed dental appointments and probably will be on a soup diet. Thanks anyhow, with cordial regards. And those of you who are familiar with his biography and his life story, sadly, he passes away barely a month later, either due to pancreatic cancer or surgery or complications related to his health. So at this point, I was going to try and just play 3 minutes of Langston reading from something. So let's see. Yeah, let's see if this works. If it does not, I will move right on. Let's see. Here. So let's see. Can we go to the last slide? Okay, so great. Okay. So what is the purpose of today's talk? Well, I wanted to highlight that 3 manuscript collections that are, for the purposes of categorization, papers for members of the dominant culture, yet they yield clues to other Black poets. Francis Woolley's papers provide evidence that Langston spoke at CU in 1946. The Folsoms had a connection to his authoring the first book of Negroes and may have interacted with him through the League of American Writers. And Florence Becker Lennon's paper led me to Rosie Poole, who edited Beyond the Blues, and the recording of these poets who read their work in October 1962. So we often overlook and underappreciate what is right in front of us. But we in ASALH's Information Professionals group know this, and we encourage our white librarian archivist colleagues to take a deep breath and dive into their collections. And so, again, here is an interesting article where this person, Lonneke Gerlings, again, a Dutch researcher, did a visual analysis of Rosie Poole's correspondence and her archives, and looked at the intersectionality and social network of Poole with all of these Black artists. And in case you're interested, Poole's archive is at the University of Sussex. And that pretty much concludes my talk, just featuring how these few pieces of correspondence in these 3 different Colorado literary papers really got me excited about another aspect of African-American history in which Colorado is at the crossroads there. So I think, let's see, here we go. So I just wanted to hear from other people if you all have any evidence of interaction with any of these Black poets or Langston Hughes. And thank you for this opportunity for me to share this with you all.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for speaking to us and for your great presentation. Since we don't have a lot of people on this side of the chat, if you want to ask a question, you can click, there is a button that says raise your hand. You can do that, or you can just type in the chat that you have a question and I'll ask you to unmute because there are controls so that you can unmute yourself. But I'll ask 2 questions that I already see, one in the chat and one that I have, one more specifically to your presentation, and that's, what poems did Hughes read of color?
Okay. So this is where I ask you to speak amongst yourself, and I'm going to go into my notes and pull this up, because you're right. For the purposes of today's talk, I just listed who is the, let's see, did I write? He, no, I did not write down. I can get that for you though. So I can share it on our information professionals Google email list. So I will write that down, because it is so obviously I have the 1 hour session of all of them reading and meeting before the first festival in 1962.
Okay. Well, my question was, you had mentioned in the beginning, and kind of the purpose of this program was to highlight, materials related to people of color and various archives. And so I wanted to know why you thought that was an important endeavor to kind of highlight this material.
So I see truly the scramble of our well-intended white colleagues who are going out and introducing themselves, or they, I think, don't realize the awkwardness of pushing one of their colleagues of color out in front of the institution to say, hey, go find us, we need to diversify. Like, don't get me started on all of the sarcastic comments I can make about that. And instead of looking at what they already hold, because the world, at any point, as we know, we all intersect. We don't run in parallel lanes. And even if, so for example, Florence Becker Lennon might be described as a lesser known poet, okay? And she lived both in New York City and in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to my diving into her collection, I did not realize that she, for example, she interviewed Anne Sexton. There are some people before they became well known appeared on her radio program, The Enjoyment of Poetry. And some of those people went on to be the poet laureates when they began a poet laureate position at the national level. And so I appreciate what our white colleagues are doing. and that the importance of being representative in our archives, and not just having settler uh, uh, holdings, but we have a lot of gold right in our midst. And so I wanted to promote this. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. We are aware of this. However, I'm going to give a slightly different version of this overview to some English students here on campus to try and get them to think that when they're interested in literary figures, think about what was going on at the time and where people might have congregated and come together and then corresponded. So that's why it's important to me, because, oh, you pick up our professional, our scholarly journals, our non-referee journals. And again, like I said, I appreciate the commitment to diversity. Of course, I ask, where was this 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago? But people need to stop and take a deep breath and look at what they currently hold. So that's why I wanted to show that even out here in the wilds of Colorado, at a predominantly white institution, we had people who actually knew some Black poets. So.
That's a great point, and something that I think a lot more people need to realize, that, you may already have material related to people of color in your collections that can be highlighted, and that you can show those. There is this kind of seeking of Black collections, especially this year as we grapple with racial discrimination for the first time. Well, not for the first time, but continue to grapple with racial
Right.
discrimination, and, sort of flared up again this year. So it's kind of the hot topic. So, I think this is these discussions are timely. And
so Rebecca wanted to say something, and
okay,
Yes. Oh, thank you. This has been amazing, and really, it definitely, I love the fact that you are finding these connections that in many ways are also telling us more about the time frame too. So what stood out to me is that not only are you talking about the dates, but you're talking about the weather. You're talking about what was going on in other arenas that nobody, wouldn't probably think about. So there was a snowstorm in Colorado while he was there. So I just thought that was really, really great. And I think that's a part of the whole idea of understanding the impact that archives could have. But one of the things, the reason why I asked you about Cullen, is because Hughes and Cullen were great friends. They spent a lot of time together. Hughes had such a respect for Cullen, and so I was wondering about that. Plus, I wanted to also tell you that that CUNY has this Lost and Found project that they've been doing on that is an amazing project, and they do these what are they called, these chapbooks, and one of the chapbooks that they did was on Langston Hughes. And it would be really interesting to contact them about what you've discovered, because that's one of the things that they're pulling together. They're pulling these are undiscovered connections between all of these writers. So I love this.
I'll do it. So Johnny, Miss Johnny.
Did you have a question, Johnny?
I think she has her speakers. I'm not sure her speakers are.
We can't hear you.
So Oh,
Yeah, you
maybe
might.
she doesn't have her speak.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
wait, she's yeah. And in the meantime,
Well,
let's see.
yeah,
Can be.
Can you hear me now?
we can.
Yes, wonderful,
Okay, good.
wonderful.
Oh, I was going to say it's so good to see that the organization has moved on to doing some of the things that we wanted to do. But Deborah, this was phenomenal. This was phenomenal. And thinking in terms of Langston Hughes and his contributions are just worldwide. And just to think those postcards look funny, but they were real. They were real. So I really appreciate you guys moving things along. So thank you.
You're welcome. To Mary Ann's question, so the Dutch connection,
Yes.
as we know, so I tell young people, like wherever I go in this country and I pull into little towns, you know, we're always looking, and we're always looking to see if anybody looks like us that are in these little towns, like in the wilds of Wyoming or southern Colorado or whatever. And so my mom, who's no longer alive, her first language was Dutch, and she was born in Indonesia. And so she was Dutch Indonesian. So she was a mixed person as well. And so I thought, oh, wow, like, so the Dutch were interested in Langston. And so Rosie Poole's story, because she was in the camps, she did teach Anne Frank in hiding.
Yes.
After the war, the Dutch Jews, some of them were also saying that they studied, or they sang and consoled themselves with Negro spirituals, with poetry. And so there was this very strong connection, and they felt like they could understand having people, or in this case, you know, the Nazis, look at them and not see a human being. So that there was, again, we forget well, we don't, but it's not necessarily taught to our young people that the Jewish, the American Jewish and African American connections in the civil rights movement. Actually, that there was this transatlantic interest and relationship. So just because it's my personal interest, I threw in the Dutch version of some of the poems, again, to remind us and to remind the dominant US culture that the beauty and the gift of Black culture is not only of interest just to those of us within our borders, that their works have been translated. And then that he meets the Senegalese poet, and that gentleman was one of the first to be in the French National Academy of Literature. So, you know, I think sometimes we get too close to a topic, too close to studying something, and we forget that there was this impact and awareness, again, from outside people looking at the Black literary arts.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you, Mary Ann.
So we have some questions in the chat. The first is from Kenvi Phillips. She said, thank you, Deborah. It's important to see and make connections. Yes, Rebecca, all of the details help to make the story of the experiences of African Americans more fuller. And then Marianne Carpenter typed, thank you, Deborah, for presenting this information. It was very refreshing to learn more about Langston. I also thank you for sharing the translation of African American poetry. Can you please elaborate why you decided to include that African American poets are international?
So you have to, I did because of my personal family history, but also it was a reminder to me of Langston's interest in African poetry, and that he edited a volume. And so Negro poets in the 20th century were not just focused on our US communities. There was great interest and awareness in reaching out. I mean, there has always been. But again, the way we teach in high school and so secondary and higher ed, we really distill things down to the bumper sticker version, and lost in all of that are these amazing connections and networks and intersections. So that's what drove me to include that aspect.
And there's another comment. She said, Deborah, I'm excited that you create a teaching moment and to encourage our white colleagues to see how universal that African-American poetry has been received.
Thank you. And I mean, that was just reiterated with the inaugural youth poet, Amanda.
Yeah.
And I remember turning to my husband saying, you know, I was so sad when we lost Maya and,
Yes.
and Tony, and all of a sudden the spark went up, and I thought, but here's this new generation, and they're beautiful, and these young people are going to continue to carry us forward. And so that was a bright and shining brief moment in that first week of this year that's already looking to be very challenging.
Yes, it's looking to be very, very challenging. I guess, had Langston been to the University of Colorado Boulder?
So he did not attend, but what I don't know, and if so, our library isn't open to the public yet. We are opening for student study space, but we're still keeping a cap on how many of us are in the building at one time. So I haven't been able to get back in. So this talk was just based on all of my notes that I've collected over the years, but I don't yet know. I have not figured out how Woolley met Langston Hughes, or did he just reach out and do a cold call, since there is other evidence in Langston Hughes's correspondence with Florence that Langston loved and had the opportunity to go and read his work at different colleges across the country. And this is really interesting also because he was under surveillance and came before Congress and testified, just like the Folsoms were under FBI surveillance because of their membership or associations with the Socialist Party. And the Folsoms, for example, were members of the American Communist Party. They were all progressives at the time, wanting to make change. So there are days, or last year, where I just thought, you know, those of us who weren't alive in the early part of the 20th century, we're experiencing what these folks experienced at the time. And so to answer the question, or maybe it's just a question I posed to myself, which is, it may be that Woolley just was familiar with Langston Hughes's work, knew he was an emerging poet, and just did a cold call and invited him to come to Boulder, you know, to do a reading. And so that's the earliest evidence that Hughes is in Colorado in 46. Now, interestingly, in we only have two pieces of correspondence from Woolley to Hughes, and the other is in the 60s. And in it, Langston mentions that he had two relatives in Denver. So that might also explain how, when Francis Woolley reached out and invited him to Boulder, just like some of us do today, oh, I'll go to that conference because then I can go see my aunt, my uncle, my cousin afterwards if I can, you know, arrange a schedule. So there were two women whose names I don't have at the ready right now, who he lists as relations in his letter to Francis Woolley. So there's that connection too.
So we do have a question in our YouTube chat. Sharita Brent said, I am not a member of the Information Professionals. However, I would love to hear the recording of the Poetry Fest in 1962. So is there a way for members of the public to hear the Poetry Fest?
So that's a very good question. I was trying to get this deposited in our digital library. And that was back in the day where then I was told I had to write all the literary executors tied to all of these ancestors who have since passed. And I have to admit, that stopped me in my tracks as I only got halfway through it. So the upside, if one can say, I was trying really hard to polish the pandemic turd last year, was that I went back into my notes and I have to start that process back up. However, what I would do is when I requested this recording, I had to pay to get it digitized. Now it's digitized, okay? So it was reel to reel, and so for preservation purposes, it's digitized. I wonder, and I don't know this for sure, maybe colleagues here do, if a private citizen gives the citation, and I can share that, put your email or your contact information in the chat, and I'll save this chat transcript. And then would you, as a private person, researcher, would you be able to contact the Library of Congress and say, okay, this is the citation and I'd like a copy of it? Most likely, yes, they'll charge you for a nominal fee, I would like to think, for copying it. But then you would be able to get it. It's an hour long thing. In the meantime, since I did this research, I'm going to say back in 2013 or 2015, our digital library platform, Luna, our colleagues are now doing this. So I could, without having secured all the copyright and permission, I could deposit it in the CU Boulder Digital Library, but only students and people who have the what we call identikey, the CU login and password protected access to this, so that it would be used for educational use. And then that way students could listen to it in response to a class assignment, for example. And I can continue to chug along trying to contact these executors of these estates to see if they would give me permission to make it publicly available. So I have to do it for Gwendolyn Brooks. I have to do it, for everybody. So that's the challenge. It's the right thing to do. I have to admit, it's just that it takes time. And so it's not like we as librarian archivists have copious amount of time, even in this pandemic, but I can carve out more time to pursue this. So to the colleague who's watching on the YouTube channel, know that I'm working on it. And if you share your, I don't think I put my I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and anybody who wants to follow up, please do and remind me what you asked. There you go. And I will pursue this.
And I will put that in the description of the video on YouTube,
good.
where this will live, so that people who are watching this can also email you as well. So Great. I'll put it in the description on YouTube. But for those who are watching and may not be able to click it, it's deborah.hollis@colorado.edu. So Kimby did have a question. She said, this might be a bit much, but do you foresee your work in highlighting Langston Hughes in these collections affecting the processing and describing of other collections?
So that's a good question, because I'm fortunate that there's been a big turnover. We have a lot of new colleagues. They're very committed to the cause of also reviewing the language of finding aids and how people and communities are described. And So I am talking to them about things like this. Now, like I said, I really need to follow up and get back to our colleagues at Yale about the typo for Florence Becker Lennon. But I'm just going to put in an email. I'll just send it to their general, email and point out that, hey, I see that you have the League of American Writers. He had a file, and these are the Coloradans whose paths he crossed. So I'm going to do that. I don't know how receptive our colleagues at Yale will be, but I can say that my colleagues here at CU Boulder are willing to entertain additional information that might be helpful when people are searching finding aids in various portals and things.
Great. Well, as I see our time going away, I do have one final comment. As you mentioned, her name was misspelled. It made me think of a time when I was looking at another finding aid, and there was a picture of Mary McLeod Bethune,
Mm-hmm.
and they had her listed as unknown. And I said, well, anyone who knows anything about Black history would know that this is Mary McLeod Bethune. And so, I guess it goes back to just making sure that our finding aids are correct and that the people who are processing these collections understand the history and know the history and know who they're actually talking about.
Sometimes they don't. We're interested in this aspect of history, so we just have to be gentle or reach out and hope that they'll take constructive criticism and proposed edits and stuff. So I can't thank everyone enough for watching and giving me some feedback, and I will also follow up with the group email about the poems that from Cullen that Hughes read during this. So thanks so much.
Fantastic. And thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this program. Continue to like, comment, and subscribe to videos on Asala TV. Asala has a month-long Black History Month festival coming up. So set your reminders to watch those videos. And